Anytime we have a set of data, we want to describe four things about that set of data. We want to describe the data distribution shape. We want to talk about the data distribution's measure of center, its measure of spread, and whether the data distribution has any outliers or not. In this lesson, we are going to talk about four different measures of center for data distributions. These four measures of center are all statistics or functions of the data. We have the mean, the arithmetic mean, the median of the data set, the mode of the data set, and the trimmed mean of the data set. Let's first talk about the mean. How do you calculate an arithmetic mean? You add up all of the data values and you divide by the number of data values that you added. That's what this summation notation means. We add up all of the data values from the first data point to the nth data point. After we have that sum, we multiply by 1 over n, or simply divide by n. Is the mean a resistant or robust statistic? The answer is no. The mean is influenced by an extreme value or an outlier. When do we want to use the mean as our measure of center? You want to use the mean as your measure of center if the data distribution is relatively symmetric. Remember we said knowing the shape of the data distribution is important. If you don't know the shape, you won't know whether you have a symmetric distribution or a skewed distribution. So again, use the mean if the data distribution is relatively symmetric and the data set does not have extreme points or outliers. Now let's talk about the median of a data set. How do you calculate the median? First, you want to order the data points from least to greatest. Once you have the data points ordered, decide whether you have an odd number of data points or an even number of data points. Calculating the median depends upon whether you have an odd or an even number of data values. If the number of data values is odd, then the median is just the very middle data point. If the number of data points is even, you need to average the two middle data points. Add the two middle data points together and divide by 2, and that is your median. Is the median a resistant statistic? Yes, it is not influenced greatly by an extreme value or an outlier. When do we want to use the median? Use the median as your measure of center for a data distribution when you have a non-symmetric data distribution or when there are extreme data values or outliers. A third measure of the center for data distribution is the mode. The mode is just the data value that occurs the most frequently in a data set. The last measure of the center of a data distribution is the trimmed mean. How do you calculate a trimmed mean? First, you want to order the data points from least to greatest. There are many different trim means you can calculate. Typically a 5% or a 10% trim mean is the most common. If we are calculating a 5% trim mean, you want to determine the number of data points to trim off the bottom and the top of the data set. What you do when you calculate a trimmed mean is you remove data points from your data set, the bottom 5%, the top 5, bottom and top 5% if you're doing a 5% trim mean. If you're doing a 10% trim mean, you chop off the bottom 10% and the top 10% of all data values. You come up with a new smaller data set and you calculate the mean for that smaller data set. So if you are calculating a 5% trim mean, you determine how many data points to trim off the bottom and the top of the data set. The number that you're going to trim off is 0.05 times the number of data points, 5% of the number of the data points. If it does not turn out to be an integer, then just round to the nearest integer. Once you have this value, you want to remove that many data points from the smallest end and that many data points from the top end of your data values. Now you calculate the mean of this smaller data set and that is your 5% trimmed mean. If calculating a 10% trim mean, again, determine how many data points to trim off the bottom and the top of the data set. The number you will trim off is 10% of the number of data points. Again, if 0.1 times n is not an integer, then round to the nearest integer. Remove that many data points from the low side of the data set and 0.01 times n from the top end of the data set. Then you calculate the mean of this smaller data set, and that will be your 10% trimmed mean. Is the trim mean a resistant statistic? The trim mean is more resistant than the mean, but less resistant than the median. So in terms of resistance, the trim mean falls between the mean and the median. So when given a data set and faced with the question, which measure of center do you use? The answer typically comes down to the shape of the data distribution and whether there are outliers or not.